Psalm 62, starting with verse 1. For God alone my soul waits in silence. From him comes my salvation. He alone is my rock and my salvation, my fortress. I shall not be greatly shaken. How long will all of you attack a man to batter him like a leaning wall, a tottering fence? They only plan to thrust him down from his high position. They take pleasure in falsehood. They bless with their mouths, but inwardly they curse. For God alone, O my soul, wait in silence, for my hope is from him. He only is my rock and my salvation, my fortress. I shall not be shaken. On God rests my salvation and my glory. My mighty rock, my refuge is God. Trust in him at all times, O people. Pour out your heart before him. God is a refuge for us. For those of low estate are but a breath. Those of high estate are a delusion. In the balances they go up. They are together lighter than a breath. Put no trust in extortion. Set no vain hopes on robbery. If riches increase, set not your heart on them. Once God has spoken, twice have I heard this, that power belongs to God, and that to you, O Lord, belongs steadfast love. For you will render to a man according to his work.
Last week, we just kind of asked this question last week. What do we do? What do we do if we kind of just feel stuck in the spiritual life? Right? Knowing that all of us are into different degrees of our spirituality. Some of us would call ourselves Christians, some wouldn't. All of us, to some degree, have a spirituality, a part of us for sure. But for those of us that feel stuck sometimes, what does that look like as Christians to feel stuck in our spiritual life? Like, what happens when the flame of our soul is barely lit and it's not keeping us warm and we feel cold to God? And one of the questions we just kept asking was like, why is Christianity so boring for so many of us? We know deep down, I think we know deep down it shouldn't be boring, and yet for so many of us it seems boring for us. If you look at the Bible, like if I look at the Bible at least, I don't see boring, right? Jesus isn't bored, and the disciples don't seem bored. They all die, right? They all die because of what they believe and what they say and what they're doing, but they're not bored. And so why is Christianity so boring for so many of us? And so we just kind of asked that question. And what we said was maybe the answer lies in how Jesus lived. The example that Jesus set for us, if he wasn't bored and those people that followed closest to him weren't bored in their spiritual life, then maybe there's a clue there in how we should live the spiritual life and not feel stuck all the time, not feel so bored all of the time. And I think one of the reasons why we miss that is because we're so focused on Jesus' death. And we should talk about the cross of Christ. We should talk about his death for sins, our sins, that in him, in his, the cross of Christ provides forgiveness to us freely and fully. And there's mercy for us and all of that. Like, we should talk about that. For every one look at our sin, we should be taking 10 looks at the cross of Christ and believing again in all that the gospel provides in his death, but the gospel provides things in his life too. Right? The good news of Jesus isn't just his death, it's his life, death, and new life that we can now have in his resurrection too. And so we said maybe there's some things in his life that can actually give us an example for how we should follow him in his spiritual life. And so here we kind of just categorized it in two ways. When we look at Jesus' life, he seemed to practice two things: the spiritual disciplines and the spiritual gifts. Right? So the spiritual disciplines, these rhythms of Jesus getting away to be with the Father, fasting and silence and meditating on the word and prayer, like Jesus just getting away with the Father, those spiritual disciplines that for millennia, Christians across, every culture and place and time have been practicing these kind of spiritual disciplines that Jesus showed us how. And then he was empowered by the Spirit. Like, Jesus did that Jesus stuff in the fullness of his humanity, right? Jesus is fully God, but fully man. and in the fullness of his humanity, he's anointed with the Spirit. He starts his earthly ministry, and he's empowered with the Spirit to do all of the spiritual gifts, and then he gives us the Spirit that we might do those things too. Right? So spiritual disciplines and spiritual gifts. And so that's what the rest of this series is going to be about. And here's kind of the image that we wanted to create for us as a collective people the next 7 weeks is just we're going to go out into the woods together, gather some kindling, throw it around the collective soul of this church, and ask God to light it on fire. Right, that our hearts might be warm to him, that we might shine lighter and brighter than we ever have, that it might be hot, that if we would follow Jesus, maybe he would show us what a white, hot, passionate, not boring spiritual life might look like. Amen? Like that's our hope, right? That we would not be stuck because, man, this is a really dumb thing to do if you're just doing it because you're supposed to do it and you're a Christian and so you're going to come to church every once in a while. That's boring, right? This is boring. Yeah. If you're not doing this to be all in, passionate and hot for all that God would have for us, then I don't know why we would be here, okay? So that's our hope. That's what we want. That's what we're wanting to do these next few weeks or so. And so we're going to start with the spiritual disciplines. I'm not going to cover all of them. Just the next 3 weeks, we'll cover 3 of them, right? One each week, depending on what book you read or what resource you use. There's about 10, 11, 12 different historic disciplines that the church has practiced in our personal spiritual life. We're just going to cover 3 of them. And this week, we're going to cover what's called silence and solitude. Okay, we're going to talk about silence and solitude. Now, I don't know about you, but anytime I've ever heard anybody talk about like silence or rest, or I've read a book on silence or rest, or listened to a podcast, just anytime somebody talks about silence and rest, I feel like my like just default visceral reaction is to just take a deep breath, and out comes this kind of exhale of anxiety. Like just anybody's like talking about a nap, and I'm like, oh, that sounds awesome. And so look, this is what I want for you. I want you to take a deep breath. I want you to take a deep breath, and I just want you to breathe out the frenzy of your soul. I want you to breathe that out right now and just trust that the God of the universe actually wants to speak with you and meet with you and talk to you in this very place and to give you peace and rest. So just kind of breathe out the frenzy of this week, and we're going to talk about this spiritual discipline of silence, okay? All right, so Psalm 62. The first thing I want us to do is I want us to see what this discipline of silence is. And so look first at verse 1, and then we'll look at verse 5 as well. Verse 1 and then verse 5. For King David, he writes, For God alone, my soul waits in silence. And then verse 5, for God alone, now he's going to preach to his heart. For God alone, O my soul, wait in silence. King David, he's writing this, and Connie, she read the whole text, so you know, like, his enemies are coming after him. There's chaos around him. Everything is falling apart in David's life, and he says, so I'm going to get alone with God and be quiet. I just think that's amazing because that's so contrary to everything I would do in that kind of situation. Right? If chaos was around me and everything was falling apart and enemies were coming after me, I would not be like, I'm going to be quiet. I would be like, I want to punch them in the mouth, right? Literally, figuratively, whatever that looks like, somebody's coming after me, they're going to go down. Or if something's broken in my life or there's chaos in my life, I want to get after it and fix it. Anybody else? And David says, no. I'm going to sit quietly before God. Everything is chaos around him. And he says, I want to be silent before God. The spiritual discipline of silence, it's the discipline of withdrawing from people and noise for a period of time for the purposes of being alone with God. And the reason why this is such a traditional historic discipline is because it's found in the practice of Jesus. Right? Often throughout the Gospels, we see Jesus doing his Jesus stuff, doing his ministry, but then withdrawing to get away with the Lord. I'll give you a couple of examples. We talked about a couple last week as well. Mark chapter 1, verse 35, rising very early in the morning, while it was still dark, he, Jesus, departed and went out to a desolate place. Matthew 14:23, after he had dismissed the crowds, he went up on the mountains by himself. One author says, pursuing silence and solitude is freeing yourself from the addiction to and the distraction of noise so you can be totally present to the Lord. And then I love this, to open yourself up to God in the place beyond words. David says, "Oh, my soul, wait in silence. Get alone with God and be quiet." There's a famous mathematician, philosopher from the 17th century, Blaise Pascal. He talked often about silence, actually. He has a famous quote about it. He says, "Nothing is so insufferable to man as to be completely at rest." We can't do it. Without passions, without business, without diversion, without study, because then, this is why they don't like it, right? This is why we don't like it. Then he feels his nothingness, his forlornness, his insufficiency, his dependence, his weakness, his emptiness. There will immediately arise from the depth of his heart weariness, gloom, sadness, fretfulness, vexation or frustration, despair. And then this is his famous quote, "I have often said that the sole cause of man's unhappiness is that he does not know how to stay quietly in his room." That we don't know how to be quiet. So he's challenging us. Pascal is challenging us from the 17th century, and he's saying, try it. Like, get alone with God. Get away from the phone, away from the books, away from the music, away from people, and just get alone. Try it for an hour. Sit in your room and just be quiet. And he's saying we can't do it, we don't do it, we tend not to because we would rather create these diversions, these distractions that kind of keep us from that place of silence because we're afraid of what's going to get stirred up. Man, I don't know what's down there. And so we want to busy ourselves, distract ourselves, stimulate ourselves that we might not sit in the quiet at all. Think about how often you are in noise and how little you're in quiet. Like, how often are you listening to music? How often is the TV on? How often are you on your phone? How often do you have the podcast going? How often is it noisy? And how little is it quiet? So much of our life is doing and so little of it is being. Right? We're human beings, but most of our lives are human doings. And so we're never quiet before God. My wife's grandfather, he was a deputy director of NASA. Was a part of the first group to send, to send the guys to the moon. And in our house, we've got the first picture of Earth captured from space. And so I've just always been interested in that stuff. And NASA, they actually have to train their astronauts in silence. Because of how quiet it is in space, it's disorientating. We're not used to quiet. And so they actually have to train their astronauts in kind of spaces of quiet. And so the quietest place on Earth is in Minnesota. It's an anechoic chamber that they built. Google it later, right? And it's freaky looking, like you don't want to go. It's got like cones sticking out of it to kind of block all the sound, and it's black, and it looks terrifying. And it's literally -9 decibels in the anechoic chamber in Minnesota, okay? And so what they say is that you become the sound. It's so quiet, there's no noise at all that you actually become the sound. And those that have been in it, you hear a high sound and you hear a low sound. The high sound is your nervous system. The low sound is your circulatory system. Sounds terrifying, right? Yeah. And so you're literally hearing your heart beat, hearing your lungs breathe, hearing your body move, and that's it. And the longest somebody can stay in there is 45 minutes because it's so just disorienting. It's so, abnormal to us for us to be in places of quiet. And then in C.S. Lewis's famous book, The Screwtape Letters, which is a book of satire. I've never read it. It's such a genius book. It's a book of satire where this older demon, this kind of senior level demon, Screwtape, is writing letters to a younger demon, mentoring him, which is nice, right? Mentoring the demon in how to, keep his subject from God, right? That's the whole point of the demonic activity, is to keep you from God. And so he's instructing him in that, and he talks about how silence is actually opposing what they're trying to do, that the devil hates silence. He even calls the devil's realm the kingdom of noise, and he claims in the end we're going to make the whole universe a noise. Right? That the end for the enemy is that everything would just be loud. Whereas the end for God is peace, on earth, right? And so what Pascal and what NASA and what C.S. Lewis, what they all realize is that we don't know how to be quiet. We don't know how to be silent before God. Most of you know that at the end of last year, we had you all take a spiritual assessment, a survey, so we could just get a better idea of like where we're at as a church, how can we grow as leadership, what are some things we need to focus on and talk about. And so I want to show you this chart. One of the ways in which it tried to measure where we were at was the fruit of the Spirit. And so, man, love and patience and self-control, like you all are off the charts awesome. Right, the Spirit has produced that in us, and we're loving and we're patient and all of that. But joy was low, and then look at peace. And the question that we were asked, you maybe can't read it, but it says, I am not anxious about my life as I have an inner peace from God. I am not anxious about my life. And collectively, we all said, no, we are. Actually, I am anxious. This is a safe place. Like, it wasn't a safe place apparently for the 9 because nobody raised their hand, but I think it's a safe place. How many of you that like resonates with you? Yeah. Yeah. And so I think the spiritual disciplines in general, and I think this particular discipline of silence in particular is going to be the way forward for us to find peace. When's the last time you were anxious? What are the things that make you anxious? What are you hoping for that you might feel at peace? I think a huge part of it is going to be practicing being quiet and alone before God. King David, Jesus, they practice this spiritual discipline, this kind of rhythm of silence. And in this particular psalm, there's 4 things that silence seems to produce. There's 4 things that silence seems to bring up in us when we sit before God quietly, 4 things that it seems to do in our hearts. So here's the first one, okay? The first one is this, that being silent before God shows you that God is your refuge. Okay? That God is your refuge. Look at verse 6. David says, He alone is my rock and my salvation, my fortress. I shall not be shaken. On God rests my salvation and my glory, my mighty rock. My refuge is God. Right? Our refuge is God. Twice he uses the word refuge. 3 times he says, God is my rock. Twice in this psalm, he says, God is my fortress. And twice he says, being in the presence of God means I will not be shaken. That's peace. Right? When nothing can rock the boat, when you're not anxious about anything, you cannot be shook because you're in the presence of God. God is your safe place. He is your place of peace. In Ephesians 2, it's really interesting. It says that Jesus is your peace, right? He himself is your peace, it says. It doesn't say he brings you peace. It doesn't say he's going to produce peace in you. Jesus is going to, give you peace. Jesus himself is your peace. In Isaiah, the prophet Isaiah says that Jesus would be the prince of what? Peace, yeah. Yeah, so the enemy, Satan is the king of noise, and Jesus is the prince of peace. The enemy loves chaos. Jesus loves the quiet place with you, quiet before God. Jesus is our refuge. Right now, like when we're quiet before him, it reminds us of that. Right? It reminds us that he's our refuge. But right now in the kingdom of noise, do you know what you typically find your refuge in? Like when chaos is around, when you feel busy or tired, when you need a break, where is our refuge culturally right now? It's to our phones. Literally, our phones are a fortress for our soul. On average, you pick up your phone more than 2,000 times a day. I was kind of laughing about it last night, like it's like a baby blanket, right? The iPhone is our blankie. We unlock our phone 80 times a day. We are on our phone 3 hours a day, on average. Right? 2,000 times we pick it up, 80 times we unlock it, 3 hours a day we're on it. Literally our phones wake us up and put us to bed at night. They are like a parent to us. They're like a parent, and they're doing something to us. They're affecting us relationally. One of the things that the survey showed us that we'll talk about as the year goes on is that we're struggling to connect with each other. We're around each other all the time. Our community is off the charts, but the depth of it the connection of it. And that, by the way, is a cultural just phenomenon right now in this generation. And iPhones are a part of that. MIT sociologist Sherry Turkle, her name's Sherry Turkle. Not Shelley Turk. But she has this kind of famous book on this stuff, and she said, she's done all this research, and she said something as simple as putting the phone on the table when we're interacting affects the interaction, the depth of it. That the depth of our conversation is stifled just because the thing's on the table. Not because it rings, not because we're on it, not because we're live tweeting the conversation, it's just there. And so the depth of our conversation and the depth of the intimacy of our connection is stifled because we know we're going to get interrupted. And so there's a lack of connection and depth. We know we're addicted to the things. I'm just not sure if we are quite aware of what they're doing to us. Study after study has shown that too much time on our phones has profound effects on our physical health, mental health, emotional health, and I would argue our spiritual health as well. It is just well documented that our phones produce stress and anxiety and sleeplessness and restlessness, even stress-induced shallow breathing patterns. And so our phones are our refuge, but they're a terrible refuge for us to go to. But think about when you go to them the most. When you're looking for attention, affection, affirmation, when you're looking for rest, when you're looking for comfort, when we're looking for a fortress, a refuge, that's when we go to technology, and in particular our phones. And David is saying, no, God is my rock. God is my resting place. God is my refuge. So the first thing is that we recognize, we're reminded that God is our refuge. Here's the second thing. Being silent before God gives you an opportunity to take inventory of your heart and to see what you've been trusting in. All right, so look at the first part of verse 8. David says, trust in him at all times. O people, trust in him. Jump down to verse 9. Those of low estate are but a breath. Those of high estate are a delusion. Doesn't matter if they're low class or high class. We can't hope in people. In the balance as they go up, they are together lighter than a breath. Put no trust in extortion. Set no vain hopes on robbery. If riches increase, set not your heart on them. David is saying we can't trust in people, can't put our hope in people. We can't trust in money or getting more money, but we can trust in God. But we can trust in God. What silence does is it begins to peel away the layers of noise, right? The layers of distraction, the layers of activity. Silence begins to peel that away so that your soul can be unearthed. And you can actually see what you've been hoping in. But until the layers of noise are peeled away, we can't see what we've been trusting in, what we're putting our hope in. And so as they do, you begin to realize, oh, I've been putting my trust in this thing happening. My whole hope right now is in this person doing that. My whole sense of peace and joy is if I can accomplish this. And I've not put those things before God. I've not trusted him in those things. I've just they're there. They've been buried underneath layers and layers of distraction and noise. And so the silence begins to unearth some of that, and you begin to see what you've been trusting in and how maybe you've not been trusting in God. Isaiah 30:15, it connects silence with trusting in God, where God says, in returning and rest, you shall be saved. In quietness and in trust shall be your strength, but you were unwilling. Right? God is saying, you feel tired and weak, come before me in silence and sit with me, put your trust in me. And he says, but you won't do it. We go from activity to activity and anxiety to anxiety, from thing to thing, trying to go, and it's exhausting, and we're not at peace. And so the psalmist says, put your trust in him, be quiet before him, and trust in God. The third thing silence does is it cultivates your conversation with God. Does your prayer life feel pretty stale? Silence will cultivate your conversation with God. Silence is like the white blank page of the next chapter of the story that God is writing you in. Right? That's what silence produces. Look at verse 8 again. Verse 8 again. Trust in him at all times, O people. Pour out your heart before him. Right? Pour out your heart before him. And then jump down to verse 11. Now God is speaking. Once God has spoken. Twice have I heard this, that power belongs to God. Right? So silence leads to this intimate conversation where you're pouring your heart out to God and God is speaking back to you strength, power, truth. Right? That's the conversation that gets started because of silence. Think about it. Like, how do you actually know what to pray for if you haven't been quiet enough to know what's happening in your heart? If you're just praying for the surface level things that are happening and everything is just the shotgun prayer, which, man, do the shotgun prayers. God, help me with this, man. Right now, I need it. Like, do that, but you don't really know what's happening in your heart until you're quiet. And so be quiet. And then pour out your heart. Whatever comes up, whatever stirs up, whatever gets revealed in the silence, then pour out your heart to God in that place. Otherwise, our prayers seem to go as deep as our calendar or our to-do list will go. We have to pour out our hearts before God. At the end of verse 8, when it says God is a refuge for us, it has this word, Selah. Right? Do you know what the word Selah means? The Psalms were prayers, but they were meant to be sung. They're songs. And Selah was most likely a musical term, a musical direction to the band to kind of create this reflective rest in the music. Like Selah was meant to be this instruction that said, be quiet. Think about that. Consider that. Think about what we just sang. Think about what we just read. Selah. Right? It's just creating these moments of silence for us so that when we're ready to sing or ready to speak, we're doing so pouring out our heart. And so silence, it leads to prayer, but it's a different kind of prayer. It's not the kind of prayer that you initiate where we begin to ask God for something, okay? Ask him for things. He's a loving dad. He loves to give gifts to his children. Ask him for things. But that's not this kind of prayer. It's also not the kind of prayer where God is the one who is initiating the conversation. Like when we're praying the Bible, okay? We're going to talk about that next week, where God, he's communicated to us through his word, and we're going to pray the Bible. We're going to respond back to him. That's a sweet kind of prayer as well that will elevate your prayer life in great ways. But it's not that kind of prayer. Right? Silence leads to the kind of prayer where you're processing with God what's happening in your heart. Instead of playing that stuff out in your own mind, instead of constantly churning things out in your own head, you're actually processing your soul with the God of the universe. As you sit in silence, thoughts come up, your mind drifts, whatever happens, you take it captive, you put it before God, and you pray. Eventually, there's no more anxieties or fears left because you put them all before him, and now you can hear God speak. How many of you want to hear more of God's voice to you in an intimate and specific and sweet way that lines up with the promises of Scripture? I know you do. We've had these conversations. You can't expect God to talk if you won't be quiet to listen. It's just a reality. And so silence, it creates this intimate conversation with God. And then the last thing that silence can do is it can lead to breakthrough. Look at verse 1. For God alone my soul waits in silence. From him comes my salvation. And then verse 6. He alone is my rock and my salvation. Verse 7. On God rests my salvation and my glory. The way that David uses the word salvation in the Psalms isn't the way that we typically use that word. He's not talking about eternal salvation. He's not talking about somebody getting saved, right? Meeting Jesus. The gospel of Jesus collides with your heart, and in a moment, your heart is changed and you believe. He's not talking about that. He's not talking about heaven. He's not talking about eternal life. He's talking about deliverance. He's talking about God is the rescuer. He's talking about God is our breakthrough. That's what he's talking about when he says that on God alone rests my salvation. right? We need salvation, like David is writing it, when we're up against something stronger than us. We can't do it. It's a sin we can't seem to get past. It's a relationship that's just too broken. There's something going on, and we feel stuck, and we need God to deliver us. That's the salvation that he is speaking of. And the way in which silence begins to produce or create the space for breakthrough to happen is that in the silence, your soul begins to be unearthed and your heart begins to be revealed. And so you see the anger. You see the frustration. You see that you're bitter towards somebody. You begin to get a little bit deeper into the why of the addiction or the why of this pattern that's been unhealthy in your life, and you begin to realize that it goes deeper than just what you're doing, but why you're doing it and what's happening at a deep place in your soul. Right? Silence before God, it's like going to the roots of your heart. If Jesus is the vine and you are the branches, silence is that place where you're looking at the soil in which your spiritual life is trying to grow and seeing maybe where you need more water or weeds need to be pulled. And you invite God into that place deep in your soul, the soil of your life, and you invite him to bring about growth and health and restoration and breakthrough, deliverance, rescue from the things that have kept you stuck. Silence, it can produce that. We have a tendency to put so much weight, right? The weight of our life, the gravity of our life, we have a tendency to put so much of that on ourselves and on one another, yes? Like we expect either us to be able to manage or to produce something, or we expect other people to be able to navigate us through the hard times, to get us out of the stuck place, and we put so much weight on anybody else that isn't God, who alone is our salvation and deliverer. We have a tendency to do that, and silence before God, it reminds us that God alone is our salvation, that he alone is our glory, that he's going to be the one that produces in us the man, the woman that God is making us into. Exodus 14:14, it should be the banner over you as you practice silence this week. The Lord will fight for you. You only have to be silent. Practicing the discipline of silence is an act of faith that says, I cannot do this anymore. But you can. But you can. You alone are my salvation, my rest, my rock. And so we practice this before God. Have you ever been quiet before God? We're going to practice it here in a bit. It's going to be super awkward. It's going to be really quiet. 3 just kind of practical tips as we consider this going into this week. Here's the first one. Try it for 15 minutes this week. It's better to do it longer. It takes a while to get to the roots of your soul. But if that's going to keep you from it, like just practice for 15 minutes. Do it for 15 minutes, and then week after week, try to add 5 minutes and just until you get the hang of it. But man, your mind's going to wander. You're going to be distracted. It's going to feel so weird. But try it, man. Just try it for 15 minutes this week. One time this week, sit before God in the quiet, no book, no people, no music. It could be the first 15 minutes leading into the Paradox 365 reading time for you that morning. It could be the 15 minutes right before you turn on the TV. It could be 15 minutes before you get in bed, but just practice 15 minutes of quiet before God. Second thing, you have to plan these things. So plan it, schedule it, plan moments of silence. Once you get the hang of it, begin to try to weave that into the rhythm of your life. Little mini moments of silence and then more extended moments of silence. So I try to create mini moments of silence. The last 5 minutes to work after I take my kids to school, no podcast, no music, no nothing, and then just the drive home. It's a 5-minute commute for me, and I just want to be quiet in the car. Right, I've got like my iPhone synced up to the Alexa at the house, and it automatically tells my family that I've left the office and I'll be home soon. Love you, babies. Okay? And it's in that Alexa voice. It's awesome. The kids love it, and so they know I'm on my way home. And when I walk in the doors, I want the burdens of life and ministry to have been placed on the burden carrier, Jesus, so I can walk in there and go into my most important job as husband and dad. And so that last 5 minutes, I just want to go home in quiet. I want to go home in quiet. Any sort of anxiety that pops up, anything that comes to mind about what I have to do tomorrow, I just kind of place that on Jesus and pray it away and go home praying, hopefully at peace, to enter into what sometimes is chaos. It just is. 3 kids under 9. 3. Yeah. Lastly, solitude isn't isolation, okay? Solitude isn't isolation. I just want to make sure we kind of create this difference between what maybe the world would call self-care, what the world would call getting away or escaping, and what we're talking about as a spiritual discipline of solitude. Solitude is not isolation. Isolation is dangerous. Isolation is escaping. Isolation is fantasy. Okay, that's the kind of isolation that the world would typically put forward as a helpful and healthy practice. That's not what we mean. What we're talking about is getting away to be with God. Not me time, but getting away to be with God. When Jesus was withdrawing, he wasn't escaping from all the problems of his life. He was going away to prepare to get back into the world and serve. Right? So we're not escaping to get away from people. We're withdrawing in silence so that we can go back out to the people filled up and ready to pour out. Does that make sense? Right? What I talked about last week was we withdraw from the chaos of the spectacle so that we can cultivate this non-anxious persona that we might go back into the chaos, the kingdom of noise, and bring with us peace. Right? We should be able to be like David, where in verse 8 he says, "Trust the Lord, O people." We should go back into the chaos and say, "Trust the Lord, O people. He is your rock. He is your salvation." And we can do that because we were just there. Right? We were just there. Man, why are you so at peace? Why is there such a joy about you? Man, I just sit silent before God, and he alone is my refuge. Yeah, so we're doing this for the sake of people. We don't withdraw from the world. We withdraw for the world, that we might well go back into the world and serve like Jesus served, okay? All right, I'll close with this. Tomorrow's Martin Luther King Jr. Day, and so just a great story about MLK that is fitting here. There's an author by the name of Cal Newport who tells a story about Dr. King, where early on in the civil rights movement, when Dr. King just kind of took the helm, like he was just kind of taking the leadership position of the civil rights movement, and there was just a really bad time for him. He was arrested for going 5 miles an hour over the speed limit. I mean, like full on, booked, fingerprinted, thrown in jail. He was getting death threats, and it was on January 27th, 1956, where MLK, right at the start of this movement, was laying in bed and he wanted to give up. Which I don't know why I never thought about that. Of course, he's human. Of course, there was times where Dr. King was like, I ain't doing this anymore. Right? Of course there were times. We just don't think about that. But it was just, for him, it was going to be too hard. Too dangerous for his family. Too hard. And in that moment, he was going to be done. And the story goes that he actually got up from his bed. He went into the kitchen late at night and sat down and was just alone and quiet with God. And here's what he said about that moment. He said, "It seemed at that moment I heard an inner voice saying to me, 'Martin Luther, stand up for righteousness, stand up for justice, stand up for truth, and lo, I will be with you until the end of the age.'" And of course, the rest is history. But what the author, Cal Newport, what he asks, and what he raises, the kind of question that he asks is, he said, what about that night, January 26, 1957, what if that night Martin Luther had an iPhone? What if in that place of just insecurity and fear and anxiety and tiredness and discouragement, what if in that place he escaped to technology instead of got quiet with God? Like, how much do we miss hearing the voice of God and finding the rest that only God can provide, the salvation that only God can do, because we escape instead of run to him? What would have happened if MLK had an iPhone? What a great question. And so how can we expect to hear from God if we won't be quiet? How can we expect breakthrough in our life to not feel stuck where we feel stuck if we won't come before the mighty God of the universe and just be quiet before him? He is our rock. He is our refuge. He is our salvation. He is our deliverer. And according to verse 12, to him belongs steadfast love. I mean, how can you not love this God who has that never stopping, never giving up, always and forever love for you? No matter what gets unearthed, man. I know, like 90% of the time that you're quiet before God, it's not going to be joy and gratitude that is unearthed in your soul. It's going to be insecurity and fear and sin and bitter. It's going to be all that stuff that we cover over with distractions and noise. It's okay. Whatever gets unearthed, you're unearthing it in the presence of a God who has steadfast love for you, purchased on a cross for you, love that would die. You're safe there. And so I want to practice this with you. So let's just kind of take a moment to get before God, whatever that looks like for you. You can be on your knees, you can stand, you can sit, you can close your eyes, you can open them, whatever it looks like for you to get before God. And we're just going to be awkwardly silent together. And I'm just going to pray here in a moment and just ask God to meet us in this. But as the thoughts begin to just kind of creep up, as the distractions happen, just 1 Corinthians 10, take those thoughts captive, make them obedient to God. Just place them before him. Just trust that thought, that distraction is just something you're supposed to place in the presence of Jesus, who's your refuge and your rest. Oh God, we ask that you would meet us in this place. That as we sit silently before you, that you would speak to our heart, you would stir up our heart, and that you would bring about rest and refuge and deliverance. Would you save us, oh God, from ourselves?